A very good morning to everyone present here. I am your host, Shweta, and we are live from Hall B. And without any ado, let's get started to the lecture. We have uh, Dr. Luthra as our first speaker. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Shweta, and it's my pleasure to be speaking in this important session. And the topic given to me for today's lecture is on painless PRK. So let me share my screen. Is the screen visible nicely, Shweta, now?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. So it's an interesting topic because, PRK is synonymous with pain. And, we've all those who do refractive surgery over the years, we've always understood that, pain is an integral part of any kind of surface ablations, photorefractive keratectomy, when it was the first procedure that was started. And in fact, one of the main reasons why it never became popular in the 90s was the haze and the pain and the inflammation which used to happen, and patients would be struggling, patched up in both eyes, and sometimes for 3-4 days till the epithelium healed. So there's been a huge advancement ever since, and today it is actually possible to do a PRK without experiencing any significant discomfort, thanks to newer technology and lots of new things that we've been able to do. And I'll be talking to you about those few things that can be done. So going on, we've had refractive surgery evolve in the last 25-30 years, that we've had excimer lasers from the most initial PRKs that we used to do with epithelium scraped off, alcohol assisted removal of the epithelium. And PRK was done for high corrections. I do have some patients in follow-up who were operated in the 90s in Amritsar and a few other places for as much as 20 diopters, and they are very happy patients, some of them reading 6.6, because they used to use very small optical zones. But because our understanding of PRK at that time was not great, so PRK never became very popular, and within a few years we found the benefits of LASIK, till we went overboard doing LASIK for all our patients, till we realized the risk of ectasia, because nobody realized that weakening the cornea with LASIK to the extent of more than 50% would lead to ectasia. So then we started again taking the back seat. Everybody was scared of doing LASIK, and then we evolved to LASEC, which was a modified form. Nobody wanted to go back to PRK of the old, and so a lot of development took place, and we started doing LASEC, we started doing epi-LASIK, we started finding out lots of other ways of advanced surface ablation. So it has evolved a long way, and today we are on a form of advanced surface ablation which is even more advanced than what it was 5-7 years back. And then of course the other way we evolved was into the femtolasic, and we all became conscious of the residual bed and the benefits of thin flaps. And today we are doing flapless surgery with SMILE, which has again given a lot of benefit. So today I think the two most popular surgeries would be a flapless surgery like a SMILE. In my practice, in fact, now femtolasic comes at number 3 and microkeratomy comes last. So we do SMILE and we do a lot of surface ablation, and we do very few flap-based procedures now. So talking about PRK procedures, there are various ways to bell the cat. You can do alcohol-assisted PRK. You can do LASEC, which is laser epithelial keratomileusis. You can do the Epipolis, laser in situ keratomileusis, the epi-LASIK. You could do the transepithelial PRK, which is very popular today. I'd like to do a lot of transepithelial PRK. So there is renewed interest in corneal surface ablation due to the lower risk of ectasia. In fact, biomechanically, the eye cornea is strongest with PRK, even stronger than what you might get with SMILE, even though not too many studies are still available. And there are almost there's no risk of corneal flap complications when compared with LASIK. Of course, that small chance of having corneal other problems with PRK which are unique to PRK, like the haze and more possibility of getting infectious keratitis. They are rare if you do them right, but you have to obviously be a little more careful when you do a surface procedure as compared to LASIK regarding this. So the advantages of PRK and LASIK, as we already discussed: no flap complications, faster recovery of the corneal nerves, which minimizes the amount of dryness. So dry eye in surface and SMILE is seen much less than is seen with any kind of LASIK, including microkeratome and flap and femtolasic. There is the extra margin of safety in patients with thin and borderline or steep and flat corneas. So if you're having a steep or a flat cornea, you would not want to use a microkeratome on those eyes, nor would you like to make a flap in a very, very steep cornea, because that could compromise the strength of the cornea. It could be a potentially suspect cornea. And even though the topography may be perfect on steep corneas, I sometimes try to move towards the surface. And again, if you have borderline thickness corneas, you would probably not want to disturb them by weakening them further with making a flap. So either I would do a smile or a surface. Again, smile, the parameters remain almost the same as those I do for LASIK. So there's almost no difference between my exclusion criteria for LASIK and smile as far as corneal thickness goes. However, on thinner corneas, I don't hesitate doing a small surface ablation if the topography and everything else is perfectly fine. So the preferred procedure for professional athletes who incur risk for physical contact, even a lot of people who join the forces and those people who do not want any kind of scar on the cornea from any kind of surgery, so they don't want surgery to be detected if they're appearing for a medical exam, they all would be ideal candidates for getting a surface ablation procedure. Now, the best part about surface procedures is that ectasia is extremely rare. There are just only very few reports of ectasia following a surface ablation. Of course, it is entirely possible, which is also possible in a normal untouched eye, but then PRK-induced ectasia is not very often seen. So that's a big advantage. So all the reasons why you can start doing PRK, and of course it also cuts down on the cost, because all you are going to use is an excimer laser. You don't need to invest in a microkeratome. You don't need to invest into a femtosecond laser. You don't need to invest into a Visumax for smile. And eximers can be very easily available. And there are a lot of surgeons now who restrict themselves to just surface ablation completely. And that's because we have these newer techniques which allow us to do that. Now, following PRK, there are limitations, and we all know them, but I would like to highlight them once again. Mild to severe eye discomfort, maybe in the first couple of days, has been the most common problem that PRK patients have faced, and doctors are very wary of. I know of a lot of my colleagues who are prolific refractive surgeons. Somehow they just don't like to do surface ablation procedures for the fear that the patient is going to come back and complain next morning, and for the first few days that I was very uncomfortable. Longer period for visual recovery. As compared to LASIK, there will be obviously a longer visual recovery period because the epithelium is disturbed. So till the epithelium grows back, and even much after that, because epithelial remodeling continues for a very long time. So it can take a week or two for patients to become comfortable for their vision, and can take up to a month for them to be crisp, 6x6, or even 3 months. But 90% of patients within a week are functionally good. So by the time I remove the contact lens on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th day, patients are already seeing fairly like 6/9. Even on day 1, actually, so many of them are reading 6/6 now with the new protocol that I'm following, but let's come to that later. Haze has been tackled very well with the pioneering work of Parag Majmudar and Randy Epstein. Their protocols, which I started following almost 20 years back, with 0.02% for 12 seconds, and longer if you are doing some extreme cases, has worked very well for us, and we hardly see haze. And of course, there's more to it than mitomycin, and I'll discuss that. Regression, which was one of the common things when we started doing PRK right in the beginning, was more related to the excimer ablation pattern which we were using, and we now don't see those anymore with the newer flying spot lasers with their optimized profile. So regression has been tackled really well, and now we don't hesitate, or we don't even change our nomograms when doing surface ablations as compared to LASIK ablations. So what is the current status of PRK? PRK, we all understand that now, as I said, haze is now extremely rare. The refractive stability is excellent, and I would not hesitate to offer this to patients who were looking for crisp 6x6 vision. You just have to tell them to be a little patient with the visual recovery. So what holds us back from doing more PRK? Why aren't we doing a lot more PRK than we were doing in the past? So I think in the discomfort that patients feel, since everything else is more or less kind of sorted, why are surgeons still uncomfortable offering PRK as the first choice to their patients? This has really changed in the last 2-3 years. So maybe my slide is not in order today as much as it was maybe a year or two back, before we started doing the pain control methods, which are so much more controlled now. So the pathophysiology of the subtypes of corneal pain could be inflammatory, nociceptive, neuropathic, and many things have been tried. We've had pharmacological interventions with topical opiates, 0.5% morphine, topical anesthetics like proparacaine. So post-op in the US, this was practiced quite often, and some surgeons even in India have practiced this. They used to give drops to the patient. These are known as comfort drops, which would contain a mild topical anesthetic that if somebody had too much pain. I have never done this because I'm scared that they will be overused and misused, and that will lead to corneal complications. Topical NSAIDs have been tried as post-op topical medications for pain control. They've not really been very, very effective. And then the oral analgesics, giving a tablet of, a strong opiate or something like tramadol, which would be good, oral analgesics at the time of surgery. And this does make a difference. And we also give patients tramadol combinations. Non-pharmacological treatments have been tried, bandage contact lens and corneal cooling with chilled PSS and ice patches, and people have used ice packs for post-op pain control. So lots of things have been tried. Even a bolus of oral steroid has been attempted at some places, and even we have done a study on that. So these are the kind of patches, ice packs, which can be used for pain control post-op. They do work quite well, and there's nothing wrong in using them. And we've, there have been a lot of studies, but some of the studies have said that they actually don't make much of a difference. So this study concluded that chilled BSS and the BCL do not seem to be superior to room temperature in reducing post-PRK pain, but subjectively, some patients feel that it makes some difference to them. So our experience with this surgery has been good. And we've had, these new techniques where BCL has been used. Our experience with using the BCL, of course, has been good. And BCL helps in reepithelialization and healing to improve the comfort and reduce pain, and can act as a reservoir. So last few years, we've been using ketorolac 0.45%, which used to come as AccuVail ketorolac drops. And unfortunately, about 2 years back, AccuVail was withdrawn from the Indian market. Now, this used to soaking the bandage contact lens in ketorolac had made a world of difference. This pioneering work was done by Rohit Shetty and group at Narayan Nethralaya, and they published on this when they evaluated the efficacy of using AccuVail or 0.45% ketorolac on pain modulation. And I started using this around the same time that they were publishing this, after understanding that it really works well. And in fact, I was able to confirm their findings, and we also started doing our own studies on this. So our experience, last 1 year we've been using. In fact, we did the initial trials for this new drug, which is also 0.4% ketorolac. I have no financial interest, but I did perform about 25 patients in the first group of patients, which was studied for pain control using AccuSate, which is easily available now in India. It's because for a few months when we were out of AccuVail, we were trying to convince our Indian companies, the good companies, to start making the same drug if they could. So this comes in Unims, and it's been really, really effective. So our first 25 patients showed excellent results, almost similar to or even better than what we were getting with AccuVail. And now we have experience of almost 60 to 70 patients over the last year or so with PRK pain control using this. Let me show you how it works. So basically we use a BCL, and on the BCL, it's peeled, but you throw out some of the fluid from the peeled BSS from the contact lens pack, and then put a few drops. So the Narayan Nethralaya study actually wanted to do this for 30 minutes or 1 hour. We have only done it for, so there we are throwing away some of the fluid from that, and once that is done, we are putting it back there and putting a few drops of AccuSate. And I only like to soak it when I start the case, which means about 5 minutes. So by the time my ablation is over, the soakage is enough, and the pain control is extremely good. If you would like to soak it longer, you are free to do that. But since it is accomplished with just about 5 minutes of soaking, so I don't see any reason why we need to soak it much longer. Now, once my ablation is complete, I would wash the cornea with chilled BSS for a while, and then use mitomycin. And then I would wash the mitomycin, and then place the BCL soaked in AccuSate, and this helps for the first 24 hours, after which the patients are, as it is, fairly comfortable. So let's see how it helps. Some of the other important steps: chilled BSS irrigation right after the ablation, and mitomycin C application. So if I'm ablating very small ablations, say 10 to 15 microns, I may elect not to use mitomycin, although my thought is now that we should. And if I'm ablating anywhere up to 50 microns, I would use 0.02% for 12 seconds, and that seems to work very well for me. There are obviously different protocols that other centers follow. For example, LV Prasad follows 10 seconds for each diopter of ablation. I am comfortable doing this, but if I'm ablating more than 50 microns and up to my upper limit for ablation is about 100 microns, if the corneal thickness permits, I would do it for 30 seconds, also for retreatments. And of course, after that, the bandage contact lens soaked in Accusade. So this is another one of the. So this is an old video on how I was using the Amoils brush for epithelium removal. And today we of course do a lot of trans PRK. I have stopped using alcohol completely for more than 10 years now. And the Amoils brush seems to be within seconds, gives you excellent clearance of the epithelium. Only thing is that you cannot use this on a flap. So if you're doing an enhancement on a post-LASIK patient, you would not want to use the brush because it can really disturb the flap, and there you might want to use alcohol or some other technique or even trans PRK. So once the ablation is done, I would wash it with chilled BSS and then dry the bed and then apply mitomycin. This is of course fast forwarded, so mitomycin can be left for, and then this is a contact lens soaked in Accusade drops, Unims. Today we do trans PRK on the Wavelight platform. It's also available on the Schwinn platform and a few other platforms as well. And now the new Alcon software called Streamlight is very, very good because it removes a Plano powered epithelium. So it's specially made for this purpose. And I think if you're doing trans PRK, then the most important thing is to be doing epithelium mapping. The epithelium thickness needs to be fed in correctly, because if you have a cornea which is average corneal thickness, epithelium thickness is about 50 microns. But since we have been doing this for years together now, we realize that sometimes, even a 600 cornea would have maybe just about 50 microns of epithelium. And sometimes a 470 cornea would have like 52 or 53 microns. So there are outliers. And if you don't feed your epithelium thickness correctly, you will end up getting a wrong treatment. So if you're planning to do trans PRK, please don't use an average of 50 microns. It would be important to use an OCT based system to map your corneal thickness and then decide about the surgery. So epithelium healing is much faster. The post-op pain is much less with trans PRK, and visual rehabilitation is much smoother, because these patients, you're removing exactly the amount of epithelium which is required, and it's a very good value addition to PRK, and we are finding much and much better use for this. This is Accusade Unims which we are using. Here we can probably see one case of transepithelial PRK. So once you have dried all the excess fluid from the conjunctival fornices, and ensure that the cornea is not left dry. There should be no excess fluid on the cornea, and you should be having a relatively dry conjunctiva so that no fluid comes into the area for trans PRK. And your tear film should be intact. If it has dried up, you can do a gentle wipe with a wet sponge, which has been, all the excess fluid has been shaken off. And then you can do a gentle wipe to replenish the corneal layers. And then once tell the patient to look into the fixation light, and then you can start the ablation. It's pretty quick. The epithelium is usually gone within about 25 seconds. You'll probably be able to see it now as the ablation starts, and this is continuously followed by the treatment. So it's the epithelium first which is removed, and then there'll be a beep which will tell you that the epithelium is now gone. And then after that, you'll be able to have the second part of the ablation. Some people would like to stop between the epithelium and the treatment, and others would continue straight. There have been differences of opinion whether this works better or that. So now it is the stroma which is being ablated after the epithelium was removed, and it's over. So it's a touchless technique, frankly, and patients are very impressed because your eye is actually not even touched by any instrument, really. You're just cleaning it and washing it with the BSS and maybe with a sponge. So comfort level. So patients who are very, very hyper or anxious, this works really well because you're not using any instruments. And if they've seen a video of how it happens, they're very impressed. And then you can obviously, after the chilled BSS, you can dry it with the sponge and then apply mitomycin. And follow that up by the Accusade soaked contact lens. So this is mitomycin, and then after this we will be putting on the bandage contact lens. Different techniques are used for people who want to apply mitomycin. Some people use a small cutout sponge, which is kept on the cornea for that time. I like to visibly see and keep replenishing the mitomycin. I don't want mitomycin to come to the limbal stem cells at all. So I'm very careful not to put a soaked sponge on the cornea. I just gently apply on the central part of the ablation where the risk of haze is the highest. I will not allow it to creep to the sides of the cornea, and then adequate wash of the mitomycin. And then, of course, the contact lens can be placed on top. There goes the contact lens. We do loosen the speculum a little bit because when the speculum is being removed, sometimes the contact lens will pop out. So if the patient squeezes, now the results are tremendous. This is patient post-op day 1. She was operated previous evening at 8 o'clock with a surface ablation. And mostly you'll see eyes which are swollen and maybe watery. Photophobic patients who are not able to see much on day 1 morning. But you can just watch. So आपको रात को सोने से पहले जब लेजर करा के अपने इसके बाद में रनिंग कितनी हुई थोड़ी बहुत हुई ज़्यादा तकलीफ तो नहीं हुई जैसे आपको मैं बताया था तो पेरेबल का वाटरिंग वगैरह कितनी हुई आँख से खास वाटरिंग नहीं हुई पेन कितना हुआ अब क्लोज एंड शो फेस आल्सो नियर बाय some close and show face because eyes के आसपास कोई swelling वगैरह कुछ नहीं है ना एंड मॉर्निंग में उठ के आपको ठीक लग रहा था आईज आराम से खुल गई थी सुबह और लगातार ऐसा तो नहीं हुआ कि आँख से रेड शुगर बहुत ज्यादा हुई हो या वाटरिंग होती रही ऐसा कुछ नहीं अब वहां पे पढ़ के दिखाओ सामने चार्ट पे सेकंड लास्ट लाइन पढ़ लोगे GSCFE. Very good. Chalo ji. So I think the visions are pretty good. They're 6/6 or 6/9 even on day 1. Day 2 actually the vision may fall a little bit. Day 2 and day 3 as the epithelium healing starts and the fusion lines are there, and then by the 5th day they are pretty good, and contact lens can be removed on the 4th or 5th day. We start topical FML right on the table, and it is kept for 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes up to 3 months if I'm doing a bigger ablation, and it's tapered. We put moxifloxacin for 10 days, lubricants and a bolus of vitamin C, and then for 15 days, oral NSAIDs for 2 days or SOS, and strict UV protection. Now, this is the key to prevent haze. UV protective glasses whenever the patient has to be out in sunlight for the first 6 months at least. This is very, very important. So potential ocular adverse effects could be there with NSAIDs. So this is a warning that they can be transient burning, stinging, conjunctival hyperemia, and even SPK, corneal infiltrates, epithelial defects, and corneal melts. So if you're very careful and meticulous with your follow-ups, you can avoid most of these and treat them and pick them up early if you have to. So don't let your PRK patients go away and not come back for a week. And this is very rarely even a corneal melt. But with this particular molecule, with ketorolac, there are no reports or almost none reports for any corneal melts. I think epithelium thickness I've already spoken about. It's important. You can see here that one eye has a 53, one eye has a 56. So you have to tailor your ablation with transepithelial PRK to correct the exact amount of epithelium. Here we've done a post-op OCT, and this you can see is a contact lens in place. The epithelium has been removed. And this is a post-op healing pattern where the epithelium is beginning to grow back. So you can see that it's only about 30 to 40 microns. We follow up all our patients on OCT. It really helps us understand post-refractive surgery and post-keratoconus patients, how they respond. There are other indications we've been using Accusaid also for our keratoconus patients for cross-linking, because they also experience some pain at night. So we have done about 11 to 12 eyes so far, and the results have been excellent. We've not seen any complications, and patient comfort has been great. So what are the possible implications of what we just discussed? I think PRK currently is only 5 to 10% of the refractive procedures that we currently do in India, and many refractive surgeons who don't perform PRK at all. And so if pain was sorted out, I think there could be a major shift towards the surface, given that the risks are the lowest with the surface ablations otherwise for ectasia. And the phase of refractive surgery may completely change in the very near future if we were able to switch a lot of surgeons to surface treatments. And with that, I think I'm done. And I hope I was able to make sense. I don't know if we have discussants for this talk, but Jaspreet is there and Dr. Savleena there. If they have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. I think Jaspreet is speaking next. So Dr. Jaspreet, Dr. Savleena, any thoughts on what I just spoke about?
Also, I would like to add up if the attendees want to ask any question to Dr. they can mention it in the tab below, the Q&A tab. We would love to answer them as well.
Oh, there is a Q&A tab? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It was.
So that's okay. I think, the talk was probably self-explanatory. And I know during AIs this time, we've seen that, getting the questions and the feedback has been a little tough. I'm sure next time we'll have a better way of doing that. But all the same, it's been a pleasure to be here. And I think my time is up. So I'll request you to, invite our next speaker. I have to go into another hall. So my best regards to everybody, and I'll take leave.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Shweta.
doctor.
Proceeding further to Dr. Jaspreet. Welcome, sir.
Yes, so thank you so much. Should I start my slides?
Yes, sir.
Yes, it's all now. Yes. So am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So what we are going to be, I would be showing here is something new which has probably been used in adults, but probably never had a chance to use in children probably in the world. Because so this is something, a drug which was brought up by Entod, and it's been used in UK for quite some time. But yes, in children, probably this is the first time we use it, and I'll just be showing you some of the, you can say the magic it has when you're dealing with the children with cataract who need to undergo surgery, and how effective it is. So I would be talking about the ICAM in pediatric cataract surgery. I have no financial interest. So what by ICAM I mean is intracameral anesthetic mydriatic. So it's an anesthetic, it's a mydriatic which has been used in adults. So basically what happens is, so any cataract surgery, maybe it's children or adults, would rely on the adequacy and sustenance of pupil dilatation. The success lies there because if you have a good view, you can see it. In children, the problem is more pronounced because probably the dilator muscle is underdeveloped and as compared to the sphincter pupillae. So sphincter is quite strong in children. So therefore the dilatation is tough to get. Intraoperative pupillary constriction poses a further challenge in children. So these are some of the issues. I mean, you put topical drops. There are so many times that inadvertently, intraoperatively, when you're doing an important step, the pupil wants to constrict. So conventionally, topical mediatrics have been used in pediatric cataract surgery. Now, what are the disadvantages of topical topical drops? The dosing is universal across the age group, except in infants. So you have those drops and you just put them, advise them, they have to put twice or thrice before surgery, and that's across. It's like a blanket thing. Associated systemic side effects are there because these are absorbed through the nasal lacrimal duct and the mucosa. There's a risk of allergy, which we know toxic to the epithelium because they contain preservatives. Then children cry a lot, and so there's a washout of the drug. So the absorption in a crying and uncooperative child is also questionable. It has to cross the corneal barrier. There could be issues where you have thick corneas and you might not get a good dilatation because they have to cross that barrier. And 3 to 4 drops of drop preparation need to be used. So 3 to 4 type of drop preparation, that adds on to the cost. And of course, you have to dilute them in infants. So the combination which is available, which has been, you can say, which has changed the, you can say, the ease of doing cataract surgery in children. And of course, I mean, it's such a, you can say, it's given a peace of mind to this surgeon. What we've done over a few months is this wonderful combination of tropicamide, phenylephrine, and lidocaine, which comes by the name of Phenocaine Plus. So this is the only one which is DCGI improved and which is available in India. So it has been used in adults with good success. Standardized combinations, they produce rapid and adequate mydriasis, which has been seen a good pupillary size of maybe 7.5 millimeters after viscoelastic injection. It's a less stressful experience for the patients who might be just sitting outside and repeatedly seeing the dilatation, keep on putting drops. So it's kind of a eases out thing. So the patient is not putting those 3 drops. It improves patient flow and surgical team efficiency. These studies show that rate of capsulorhexis performed without the use of additional mediatrics had a pupil size of at least 6 millimeters, which was just prior to capsular access. So that was pretty high. So that means it had a good effect in adults. No side effects were seen related to the drug. So there has been no study in children. What we did was a pilot project. I'll be showing you some of our surgical videos that we had. We used Phenocaine Plus in all our cases. So this is the first case. So this is a 4-month infant, a 4-month where you probably would have difficulty in dilatation even with drops. So what we have is just, you can see here, what is the pupil size in this? It's maybe just 1 or 1.5 millimeters probably. The child has a white cataract. It's a total cataract. So that's like, so it's 1.5 millimeters what we could measure. So from this 1.5 millimeters, what we injected was Phenocaine Plus, and we make a paracentesis and then inject a small amount of this drug. And you can see the dilatation, which starts almost in a few seconds. So the initial dilatation is fast, but then later on, probably what we've seen is it slows down a bit. So we use a very minuscule amount of drug and it does dilate. So basically for a rhexis of about 5 to 5.5 millimeters, what you need is a reasonably good dilatation, which is achieved by Phenocaine Plus. The further dilatation can come with when you inject the viscoelastic. So it dilates, you have to wait for a few seconds probably before it achieves its maximum dilatation. And once we go further, so that's it, dilated much more. So probably after a viscoelastic, it does dilate. So basically you have a good size of the pupil in a 4-month-old infant when you want to perform a rhexis. So that's gone almost to 6.5 millimeters, and your rhexis would be around 5 millimeters, 5.5, and further dilates after putting more viscoelastic. So this is the beauty of Phenocaine Plus. I mean, you just have to inject it, get a reasonable dilatation, and then put viscoelastic and carry on with your surgery. So just to show you that there was no pupillary constriction as you would have maybe in topical drops. There are chances that there'll be some kind of a little bit of constriction, and because of that, the iris tissue can come into the IA port. So, but because of this intracameral injection, it's maintaining its dilatation. You can see here that we're performing a posterior rhexis with the same. We haven't injected anything else. We haven't used anything else, and so this is the second patient. Now this is a 5-year-old child. Of course, as I told you, it's difficult to get good dilatation in infants, but here when you have a 5-year-old child, this is what we injected, and we can see here that the pupil has started to dilate, and we can see here a glow coming and the opacification of the lens. So probably we also saw in our study also some differences in dilatation, which would be covered later on. But you can see that it's dilated fairly well, fairly quickly. And it goes on for some time. So that's just to show you that a small amount of drug is needed, hardly anything. And you can see here after viscoelastic, what a good dilatation. It's almost reaching up to the limbus. And you can perform your surgery. So that was about 8 millimeters of pupil what we got. So with that we did, the surgery becomes very easy because of good visibility. You have such a wide field. And just to show you that the pupil is not constricting anywhere. So this is the time when the pupil constricts, when you're doing an irrigation aspiration. And you can see here that the stability of the pupil which is being maintained, it's so well dilated. It's not constricting at all, even when you're doing the aspiration. So we'll be removing the lens matter, and you can see all around that nothing is coming, no iris tissue is coming into the ports. So it maintains the stability of the pupil during the surgery. And that stability, that dilatation is maintained until the implantation of the pupil. So it has a very good duration of effect as well. So coming to the third patient. Now this is a child with subluxated lens. Now in this, what we want to do is, we would like to achieve dilatation and also constriction, because our plan is that the IOL has to be implanted behind the iris. It's a iris claw lens, you can say a retropupillary iris claw lens. So what happens here is, here we can't see the edge. It's hardly faintly visible, but just see the magic what happens, how the pupil dilates. We are injecting the intracameral anesthetic, the mydriatic, and you can see here immediately the pupil starts to dilate, and we can see the edge of the subluxation. And this will, as the pupil enlarges, the subluxation would become much more clearer. So without topical drops, you are getting such a good effect. Probably, I think a lot of advantages would be added to this this intracameral anesthetic mydriatic combination. So it's dilated, the zonules are visible, of course, then because we are anterior segment surgeons probably. So I just happen to do a rhexis here and remove the lens matter because I wanted to, so the lensectomy would be done basically. So the pupil, just have a look at the pupil. It's almost reached the limbus. No other added maneuvers have been done. No topical drops have been given. It is just that small amount of phenocaine plus what we used in the beginning to perform the surgery with a good view, with a good wide view. And you can see here, it's still maintaining its dilatation. And so we remove the capsule and we're going to constrict the pupil now with pilocarpine. So there could be issues that if you are having, it's a locally acting combination. And this is what we had. After pilocarpine, the pupil constricted readily. So just see the advantages. You are not really bothered that fine, okay, if you have dilated with some locally acting drug, it probably might not constrict. So it helps us in such surgeries as well, where you want a pupillary constriction. This is a posterior iris clause what I implanted. Now coming to the next surgery. Now this is a patient of JI, juvenile idiopathic arthritis. So what would you do here? Would you like to have drops or use phenocaine plus? I mean, it has Seineke all around. Now it has Seineke, and if you just inject phenocaine, probably it might not work in these cases. So let's see what happened. That is it. And once we inject, that's it, what we're injecting. Now you see it would dilate from this place. So injecting the phenocaine plus, and you can see it's dilated from here and here where there were no Seineke, but where there are Seineke, obviously we'll have to release them. So once we release the Seineke all around, you can see the pupil is still dilating. It's like festoon type of a thing. So we release the Seineke. Fortunately, it was not that difficult. And that we did almost 360 degrees. And just see the pupillary dilatation obtained. We haven't used any kind of drops. We did not supplement it. We've just put that small amount of phenocaine plus at the beginning, release the Seineke, put viscoelastic, and have a good pupillary dilatation where we could do a rhexis easily and remove the lens matter. Even in such cases, the pupil is not constricting. Even with the margins, which are, you can say, a little floppy, it's not coming into the center. So it's the stability which this drug gives is just remarkable, absolutely remarkable. I mean, so this is the IOL implantation, what we were doing in this patient. Obviously, we performed the optic capture in this patient with the oblong rhexis. But yes, even at the end of the surgery, it's still, you have a good, reasonably good view in a patient with uveitis who's got posterior Seineke, what we just released. This is a patient. Now the next patient is a traumatic cataract with ectropion uvea, where again the dilatation would become difficult and sometimes may not dilate that properly with the topical drops. Now, if we have a targeted delivery, which we achieved with the phenocaine plus, probably it might have some advantage over the other and help in getting a reasonably good pupillary size. So that's what we injected. And it's dilating. So sometimes you have to wait. Obviously, every case is different. And it's dilating, so it's taken time, but it's dilated quite well. And once we inject the viscoelastic, see the dilatation. I mean, I'll just go back. That's the dilatation after viscoelastic. So the start is very good with this phenocaine plus, and the rest of the things your viscoelastic does. And when you are removing the lens matter, you can see it's such a well dilated pupil. There is no constriction of the pupil at all intraoperatively when you're using the irrigation and aspiration. So that's so these are the advantages what the intracameral injection has. I mean, just any type of case, you have uveitis, you have this traumatic case, you have infants, you have young children. The amount of dilatation, you can see, and thereby increasing the ease of the surgery. It is basically it gives us so much with such a little amount. You can achieve such, you can say, it has such a big advantage over the drops. And so basically, I'm just showing this video to show you that the pupil isn't coming down at all. You can do a posterior axis, go ahead, do the optic capture. So basically in the optic capture, we have to see the optic haptic junction, and we can still, so it's so well dilated, we can even see the optic haptic junction. And obviously the oblong capsular axis signifies optic capture. So this is another child. Now this is something, obviously we don't find that so common in children. In adults, yes, floppy iris is quite common. So this child had bilateral cataract, and so when we did the first eye, we had used topical drops. Now, yes, you can see here the dilatation achieved with topical drops is reasonably, it's quite good. I mean, so but the child has a white cataract, and we have to perform a surgery. We don't know what the child is going to have, how the iris is going to behave, what is the pupil size. So you have really a 7.5 millimeters pupil to start with, and that's reasonably good. So on all surgeries, obviously we make these ports. These are the side ports what we make with the 15 degrees knife. So that's one side, and then probably we did not go the whole length in. So both these side ports are made. And we had a plaque here. So we're trying to remove. So it was a type of a complicated cataract, which obviously the anterior capsular axis could not be done without Trata forceps, but we had to use a cutter to remove these fibrotic plaque, and then obviously we do a rhexis along with. So what happens here is the iris is trying to come out now, and there is some, you can say, billowing of the iris in between. This iris. So that's the irrigation aspiration when you're doing. So there's the cutter when we're using. So whenever you're using some kind of an aspiration, probably that's the time when your iris is going to behave abnormally. In all cases of in all children. So we're trying to. So that's what we had. We could do a vitrorhexis, but you can see here the pupils come down. There's iris prolapse, which is occurring, is becoming difficult for us to perform a surgery. Now this is done under topical drops. So this is a child with floppy iris where the pupil constricted, there was some iris prolapse occurring. So after removing the lens matter, we dilated the pupil with viscoelastic. It did dilate. Now when you're trying to do the rhexis, posterior rhexis, again there is constriction of the pupil. So these are some of the problems where you cannot predict which child is going to behave, how the pupil is going to behave, how your surgery is going to be ultimately affected. You can see here the pupil has come down drastically with these drops. Of course, we did do a clean surgery finally, but yes, just to show you that what is happening with the drops, that's the pupil. So how difficult it becomes intraoperatively with the drops in a few cases in children. So the other eye, because we diagnosed him as a floppy iris, we thought maybe we'll yeah, so that's the other eye of the patient. So here what we are doing is we are going to use phenocaine. This is a constricted pupil. The size is hardly about 1.5 millimeters, and we're using phenocaine plus here. So we're going to dilate this pupil and see how it behaves. Because of the floppy iris in the other eye, we did not want to do the same thing in the left eye of the child. So it's dilated fairly well, and I'll just move forward. It's dilating, and that's it. So after viscoelastic, it's dilated fairly well. So again, the child has a plaque, and then, sorry, just went on. So that's it. So basically we've done the eye, the pupil is not constricting. There is no prolapse of the iris as well. So in this eye, we had used just Phenocaine Plus, and you can see here how well maintained you can see the surgical view is as compared to the other eye, which constricted intraoperatively. So this drug really has so many advantages. I mean, it's worthwhile to use it in children because they are difficult to dilate as compared to adults, plus the intraoperative issues which can come up with topical drops, the systemic side effects which you can have. Probably you can use it like you can use adrenaline in the bottles. Again, it has to be diluted and used, or and obviously in every case probably then you would be using that. But when you have something which is so easy to procure and just requires a minimal amount of you can say just a minimal amount of drug is required to be injected, probably I think it has its own advantages, and I think we should prefer this over using adrenaline in the bottle. This is one more case. Now, what happens in ophthalmos? We have large corneal diameters, and of course, sometimes what happens is you have difficulty in dilating the pupils in cases of ophthalmos or maybe anterior megophthalmos. So we've injected this Phenocaine Plus. Sorry for this, it's some air bubble was there, so injected, but you will see how the pupil is dilating. So you can see here it's going beyond this air bubble. And it's working really fast. So this was an older child, but yes, I mean, it's something you have readily available. Just get it and inject it, and it works wonders. So I'll just forward this, because otherwise it's going to take time. So we can, just to show you, this is the Calesto markings, and you see we've achieved almost, you can say, 7 millimeters of pupillary dilatation. I mean, so 7 millimeters just with the small amount of intracameral drug. It's a fairly good dilatation what we achieved. So it's almost went to 9 after viscoelastic injection. So when irrigation aspiration is being done, you can say the size of the pupil is being maintained. There is no constriction of the pupil in such cases. So that's the beauty of this drug. So there's number of conditions. I mean, it just works magic in almost like every case. So the IOL was being implanted and it still maintained the dilatation. You can say the pupil has not constricted. So that is a small amount of drug is working for quite some time. Now coming to the last video. This is a patient, you can say an infant probably, who was dilated with topical drops. Now the dilatation achieved was not significant. We wanted to have more because we were dreading that with this the pupil might constrict intraoperatively. So with this, what we did was we thought we'll inject some intracameral anesthetic and just see how the pupil is dilating. I mean, you can see where it's going. So even when you use topical drops and you want to add on, you can use this intracameral magical solution and it will work wonders. It's going to give you a stable pupil where you can do your surgery with ease. You won't be bothered about pupillary meiosis in between the surgery. And for the duration of surgery, whatever is required when you're doing pediatric cataract surgery, it maintains the dilatation. So that's the IOL being implanted, and yes, it maintains the dilatation till the end. So basically what we saw was that we had a size of at least 6 millimeters achieved in the majority, and it was sustained. So the important part is it's sustained. There were no systemic side effects. And this was a good paper, I mean, which was published in European Journal of Ophthalmology, and it is by my faculty colleague here, Dr. Savleen, who will be talking about this. I mean, it was, so in a few patients, we did the study, and the beauty is, I mean, if you see, it's date received 3rd March, accepted 9th March. So it was such a novel idea. It's written so well, I mean, that we didn't have in this original article, I mean, accepted within 6 days is something like, obviously, we were really proud of. So this paper would be discussed by Dr. Savleen now, who's done commendable work in pediatric ophthalmology, and the way she writes papers, I mean, you can see the acceptance within 6 days. So now I'll request Dr. Savleen to kindly share her screen, and then I'll come back again. Savleen, you need to unmute.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for inviting me today. and it is all your work, and I'm happy to be sharing this podium with you and presenting this work, which I think is all yours. And so the paper was about intracranial anesthetic pediatric assisted pediatric cataract surgery. And as already described by Sir, it was published in the European Journal of Ophthalmology. So the background is, I think the foundation has been laid. The success of a pediatric cataract surgery will depend on the intraoperative pupillary dilation and the mydriasis, and how stable mydriasis you achieve during the surgery. The topical dilators are not often weight adjusted, and you deal with kids who are ranging from say 1 month to 10 years. And so how much drop to use and which one, it's not really titrated. So mydriatic effect of these drops also tends to wane off, because we use the standard doses in almost all age groups. So with this in mind, we planned the study, where we used Phenocaine plus, again, no financial interest. It's an anesthetic combination of phenylephrine 0.31, tropicamide 0.02, and lidocaine 1% for pediatric cataract surgery. It was a pilot study, so we consecutively enrolled pediatric patients after taking an informed consent from the parents and, of course, an institutional ethics board approval. We included all sorts of, all ages of children less than 12 years with the visually significant unilateral or bilateral cataract who were planned for surgery. And we just ensured that their pupil dilated whenever we examined them in the clinic, and excluded those who had hypersensitivity to the drugs in the combination. Those who had any pupillary abnormalities, any synechiae, any glaucoma, we excluded those for the pilot study. We did the routine preoperative evaluation as any case of pediatric cataract. And we intraoperatively, of course, we did not use any drops preoperatively in the operating room when we started with the surgery. We measured the baseline horizontal corneal diameter with the help of a castrovisual caliper, and then proceeded with the standard surgery. And the first step was that we made a clear corneal incisions. We have already seen the video. And then after doing this paracentesis, we injected 0.025 ml of Phenocaine via a tuberculin syringe into the anterior chamber. We waited for approximately 60 seconds for the pupillary dilatation, because that was with experience that we thought would be adequate time to get a adequate pupillary dilation. And in cases where we saw that it was not adequate enough for the surgery to be carried out, we injected a double dose and waited for another 60 seconds. Of course, we noted the time that it took for the pupillary dilatation to achieve the maximum that it could. We took screen captures because we recorded all videos. The rest of the steps were the same in any standard pediatric cataract surgery. Depending on the age, the primary posterior capsulotomy and the anterior vitrectomy was done. But by and large, after the recording was complete, an independent person, an independent observer, took screen captures from the videos at 5 time points: at the start of the surgery, after injection of Phenocaine, and then after viscoelastic injection, just before intraocular lens implantation, and at the end of the surgery. Where intraocular lens was not implanted, the end of the surgery was the time point that was considered. Now you see these are snapshots which are taken at the required time points and exported to the ImageJ software. Now we knew from the castrovisual caliper what was the corneal diameter, which was pre-measured, and we fed it in the software as a scale. And then pupillary dilatation was automatically computed from the software, so that we have a standard calculation, and the observer did not know what the surgery was and drug was used or not. So representative photograph of how dilatation was measured, and this is the corneal and this is the pupillary diameter as shown. We had recruited around 16 eyes, and they were all age range 1 month to 10 years, and equal distribution of right and left eyes. We also did have 4 patients who had microcornea. Average time for the whole surgery was also noted, and average time for pupillary dilatation, which was in fact the most important point, was around 60 plus minus 13 seconds. This is a table showing all the patients, and you can see that the corneal diameter ranged from 10 to about 12.5. And these were the cases who had microcornea, the ones that are marked with this symbol. The axial length was again, we had patients who had microphthalmos as well. And at every time point, the mean pupillary dilatation from the ImageJ software was calculated. We also tried to see how much the pupil changed over time and how much the pupillary diameter variation was noted during the surgery. So the mean pupillary dilatation increased from about 1.9 at baseline to about 5.68. So keeping in mind, we had cases of microphthalmos as well. So this is 5.6. That's why we get this as a mean value. And there was a correlation between the pupillary diameter and the baseline pupillary diameter, and of course the axial length of the patient. There were 75% patients who had a pupillary diameter of more than 6 mm at all time points of the surgery. And if we exclude the ones that who had microcornea, we had a pupillary dilatation of 6.6, which was very good um, as a mean value. So again, a representative photograph showing how the pupil dilatation was maintained throughout the surgery, how the pupillary dilatation in fact increased towards the end of the surgery, and most importantly, we did not observe any intraoperative miosis in any of these patients. In all these patients, we could complete the surgery without any supplementation, and there was this consistent increase in the pupillary dilatation throughout the surgery. If we look at the variability also, the pupillary size never dropped. This graph is showing how it kept on increasing and almost maintained to about 6.6 to 6.8 towards the end of the surgery. Again, reiterating, there were no cases of miosis, no cases of iris bleeding, damage, or floppy iris noted. And the mean variability was around 1.5 mm, which was clinically kind of insignificant. The average change in pupillary size from injection till the end of surgery was positive. So no patient had a drop in the diameter of the pupillary measurement till the end of the surgery. We did do augmentation of the drug in 2 cases because we thought that the pupillary dilatation was not adequate. But once we augmented the drug, we saw that the change was only about 0.6 mm. So double the amount injection also did not bring about a significant increase in the dilatation received. We did not have any cases of blood pressure abnormalities because these patients were all done under general anesthesia. So these systemic factors were being monitored. Post-operatively also, there was no case of corneal haze or inflammation or raised IOP that we saw. We did feel at that time point that we had less number of patients and we did not have a comparison now. So I think that's the future. That's what we are planning, and we plan for a randomized study where we can compare the topical standard modality versus this newer and effective intracameral combination of mediatric and anesthetic. So we concluded with the study that prompt and stable mydriasis was achieved in children with intracameral injection. And coupled with so many advantages that Dr. Jasprit has so nicely elaborated with all the videos. And that also with a minuscule dose, we recommend this paper recommends this as an effective and safe alternative to topical drops. Again, thank you, Dr. Jasprit, for your unconditional support and for bringing these kind of opportunities my way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Savleen, for that wonderful presentation and the hard work you've done to get this paper out. So I'll just conclude in a few slides by just the last 2 slides. So this is what being discussed by Savleen now. So basically what we saw was that adequate and stable mydriasis is achieved with intracameral anesthetic mediatic combination, and which is obviously only available is Phenocaine Plus. I still call it and I still repeat it that it's a magic bullet for the pediatric eye. So the advantages are targeted drug delivery, new ocular surface toxicity or systemic side effect. You're doing away with all those preservative issues. In COVID times, you don't know when the patient is taken up, GA sometimes delayed, sometimes so all these things add up because you put dilators and the patient is delayed, probably you would lose some amount of dilatation. Prior gonioscopy possible in an undilated pupil. So that's the advantage. Even though we don't do surgery at that point, but yes, in case where it's required, probably you could do gonioscopy because the pupil is not dilated. Even in those who are allergic to atropine or cyclopentyl, it's a very good alternative. And it's cost effective. You're not using 3 drugs, which will cost you maybe about 300 rupees. It's just a simple one, probably costed less than 1/3 of the price, and delivering something which is quite fast. So that's the beauty of the intracameral anesthetic mediatic when you use it in children. And yes, I'd like to thank Entod for this, for bringing out the Phenocaine Plus, which has really changed the way pediatric cataract surgery is done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. It was quite insightful. With this, I announce for the closure of this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Saveen and Dr. Jasprit. Thank you.